In a universe that almost is, just out of reach beyond the edge of reality, mysterious forces underlie the fabric of existence. Energematrice 6, the very energy of creation, serves as both the elixir of life and the arsenal of destruction for its human and not-so-human denizens.
Crushing darkness, whose source they cannot fathom, grips the cosmos and its people. In anguish, they dream of the long-foretold bright star.
Join us as we embark on an epic journey, exploring the universe of Energematrice 6.
And welcome everybody, and we are live. This is episode 29 of the Energematrice 6 podcast, and we are, I just got back from a long trip out to Kansas, and so my brain's still a little foggy, but I do have good news that the second book in the Mythologia series, the one after Winter Night, I just got my editor to agree to look at it for me, so that's going to commence here in a couple of days, and that's awesome. And then after that, it's pretty much just a matter of getting it published, and beta reading will happen simultaneously, so you both will get a copy too, which is awesome. Okay, we are dealing with the Vale of Mysteries, Chapter 6 today, I believe. And real quick before we get to that, the Energematrice 6 podcast operates on a value-for-value model. That means that we hope if we provide some value to you in your life, that you'll return that to us in whatever way you can manage. If you're interested, head over to e6universe.com and sign up for our email list to get our free ebooks, and hopefully buy a physical book or some merch while you're there. Or if all you can manage right now is to leave us a good review somewhere, 5 stars or some kind of positive rating, that's more than appreciated. Thank you. And this is The Vale of Mysteries, Chapter 6.
A key is nothing without a lock. One piece of a puzzle provides no clarity without its brothers. In life, our path is darkness. Only in hindsight may we find illumination.
Aurelia the Seeker, recorded 428 NST. They crowded out the airlock to make the short hop over to Hope 1. A spacewalk outside was somehow a much different experience than being inside the behemoth. The infinitude of space had a weight that drove itself instantly into the consciousness, even inside the veil, with the tremendous dust clouds surrounding them on every side, refracting rainbows from the incredible power of Sanctuary's blue-white sun. They all felt it, as attested by the silence over their suit radios once Adamant's airlock had opened. Each of them pushed off gently from Adamant toward the airlock on Hope 1, which they could already see had handholds surrounding it. They reached it one by one, and they all managed to grab on without trouble. By mutual unspoken agreement, they allowed Rachel to examine the airlock's controls. After a brief once-over, she announced,
"It's coded."
There was a moment of silence. Then John said,
"Try Trisha."
Oh.
Rachel said. She keyed something in. The light on the airlock glowed, and it slid open, silent in the vacuum.
That was Mom's name.
She said, after a short silence.
Dad must have expected it would be us. I mean, I know Terrence said he had, but...
She trailed off and pulled herself forward into the airlock. Considering the size of the ship, the airlock was surprisingly small, barely big enough for 5 of them at once. As it cycled, Shannon remarked,
It's amazing that this stuff works. It's been 1,000 years, right?
That's like 3,000 Earth years?
She looked a bit overwhelmed by the sheer amount of time. Rachel shook her head, half smiling in memory.
Dad always had a knack for leaving things so they'd work when they were needed. It was one of his talents. Besides, null gravity makes a lot of difference, and it's all been asleep.
Laura commented,
I think there's even air in here. Not sure whether it's breathable.
A quick look into the fields confirmed that she was right, and as the airlock opened into the ship itself, Nate unsealed his helmet. The air inside Hope 1 smelled like machinery and old grease. But Nate didn't have any trouble breathing it, and light flooded into the airlock from the corridor beyond. After a moment, John noticed what Nate had done, and he frowned.
You know that could have killed you, right?
Nate grinned crookedly and popped his helmet loose completely. After a little consideration, the others followed his example, and Nate said thoughtfully, The others should be through soon enough. I'm not sure about you guys, but since the air's good, I'm going to leave my suit here. Nods went around the group, and all 5 proceeded to strip their suits off. Once the airlock had cycled open again and the rest of the group was busy stripping off their suits, Rachel turned down the passage to her right and began pulling herself along via handholds recessed into the wall. John, Nate, and Shannon followed silently, with John behind Rachel and Nate bringing up the rear behind Shannon. The lights in Hope 1 came on well ahead of them and went off again once they had passed, but even in the space directly around them, the ship's corridors were dimly lit. Some of the lights had failed with time, and a thin layer of fine dust had collected on every surface. Nate had no idea where it might have come from, but they stirred it up as they passed, making him sneeze now and then, following as he was. The trip from the airlock took what felt like an age, and they made it in silence, buried in their own thoughts. Finally, Rachel came to another closed hatch, which she took only a few seconds to open. The corridor beyond turned at a right angle, and Nate realized that what they'd been pulling themselves along was actually a ladderway. Hope 1 had been built vertically, with the nose pointed upward. What they were entering now was actually a short corridor that crossed the width of the vessel, with a hatch to either side of them and another pointed toward the nose of the craft when they reached the center of the corridor. Rachel stopped again and spent a longer time with this hatch. Just when Nate was about to ask what she'd found, Rachel smacked the hatch with one hand, and with a resounding crack, it sprang open. Rachel looked back at Nate with a wry grin.
Aqueous' privilege. The lock was frozen and it's our ship.
She made a face as she ran a hand over the warped hatch frame. Nate blinked in surprise. Aqueous?
Didn't you know?
She shrugged.
Aqueous specializes in mental or physical force. I got mostly the physical.
Rachel pushed through into the next room, which would actually have been above them, Nate realized, if the ship had been oriented properly in a gravity well. It was unmistakably the bridge, and as he followed the others through, Nate looked curiously around. Unlike aboard Adamant, the control stations here were arranged in a circle, and the room's ceiling was further away than either of the walls, suggesting to him that they must be right in the nose of the craft, near where the cone came to a point. All of that was pushed out of his mind by the curious mass in the center of the room. Dominating the massive bridge was a giant cloud, or so it seemed at first glance. The lights mounted around the perimeter of the room and at the control stations didn't illuminate it perfectly, but even so, he could see that the roughly spherical mass nearly filled the space, with tendrils and arms extending toward the control stations that ringed the bridge. Nate and the others had all caught hold of something, whether the room's broken hatch in his case, or the nearest control station in John and Rachel's. Shannon was hovering near the wall, her head cocked, staring at the thing.
It's the Vale,
She said, wonder filling her voice.
I wonder what Dad did to create it.
John half grumbled.
Looks like we get to see that at least.
Cautiously, Rachel reached forward from where she clung to the control station and passed her hand through one tendril of the cloud, her eyes glued on her hand. No swirl of dust followed her movement. Was the cloud a projection? A hologram?
Can't feel it.
She said. Nate opened his senses to the fields and examined the cloud. The most obvious feature was a pulsing, a vibration that brightened and darkened the cloud almost too rapidly to perceive. He watched it, fascinated as the seconds passed, and the cloud shifted slowly, waves flowing across its surface. It was an intuition as much as anything that connected the pulsing and the movement in his brain. But suddenly he could see it clearly. The cloud moved the tiniest bit with each pulse of light. It was the light that was causing it to shift and change. A sudden suspicion crossed Nate's mind, and he pushed off gently from the hatch where he clung toward the cloud. It took a moment for him to reach it, but as he passed into it, he heard Shannon and Rachel exclaim in surprise. Rachel called out.
Voids, Nate, be careful!
Then his vision was blocked completely. He could still hear without significant muffling, and he could breathe just fine, but his sight was completely obscured by the brownish cloud. Even worse, his Energematrice6 sense was flooded with the strobing energy that brought the cloud to life. Well, if there's anything dangerous in here, I'll definitely be the first to find it, Nate said wryly, a tick late. Even if I can't actually see anything. Drifting through the cloud, Nate moved his arms back and forth, feeling for anything solid in the murk. Just when he thought he must be almost through the other side, Nate found what he was looking for with his chest, crashing into it full on without any kind of warning. The air rushed out of his lungs. Even in zero gravity, inertia had its way. He flailed instinctively, grabbing for the thing with his arms as he bounced off, and managed to wrap them around it, pulling himself in. At such close range, the pulses of light that were obviously coming from the thing he'd wrapped himself around were blinding to his Energematrice6 sense. From this range, he could actually feel the energy flowing out of the object into the cloud, as if it were moving through his own body. As his mind traced the threads of power, he could distantly sense connections between the cloud around him and the unimaginable vastness of the Vale itself. Any detail was lost to him at first glance. The pattern was too complex, and the pulses were too intense. It was like being blinded by a strobe light while trying to read fine print. He gasped, sucking air back into his lungs, then refocused on the object. It felt like a big ball that he was hugging against his chest. He could see the Energematrice6 flowing through the ball, from the center to the outside, then back to the center again, as rapidly as the strobing, brilliant pulse of energy went through the cloud that represented the Vale. Obviously, it was the source of that dazzling incandescence, but looking inward, Nate could see that the Energematrice6 ran through uncountable tiny channels in the crystal globe. They stretched inside to outside, outside to inside. The channels were both many and one, a collection of myriad tiny veins that were just that, a collection. And that collection was a switch, or possibly a gate. He took in the totality of the object and the tiny space between flashes before being blinded once more. Some of the channels were closed, more than half even. But the rest? Hoping he was right, Nate pushed on the collection of channels with his mind, and both the flow and the strobing suddenly stopped. Nate blinked, staring at John, Rachel, and Shannon. The cloud was gone. Nate moved his head, the motion causing him to drift. His arms were still wrapped around the crystal globe, which was now free of whatever had bound it to the center of the ship. Everyone was speechless as Nate began to slowly tumble. Then Rachel said disbelievingly,
I hope you meant to do that. Something tells me Sanctuary's not going to be real pleased.
Nate shook his head. I just made it go passive. I don't think I actually shut the Vale off. Not exactly. He paused, then added, maybe if we brought it back and gave it to the council, or... He trailed off thoughtfully. Rachel shrugged, but nodded in acceptance. Meanwhile, Shannon had pushed off from the wall, flying toward him. She reached out an arm to him, and he grabbed it as she floated past, allowing her to pull him into motion toward the opposite wall, one arm still wrapped around the globe. When Nate finally managed to catch hold of a control console after pushing off the opposite wall, he took a moment to catch his breath. Then he unwrapped his arm from around the globe and actually looked at it, allowing it to float in front of him in the dimness of the bridge. Even without his Energematrice 6 sense, it was breathtaking. If someone could have made a marble the size of a beach ball, then put a living, moving replica of the Vale inside, that was what he beheld. Through his Energematrice 6 sense, it was even more spectacular, if for different reasons. Energy in 1,000 shades flowed through a myriad of intricate patterns inside it. Nate imagined if he could see the electrons moving through a computer, this was what it might look like. They all stared at the object for a long time, spellbound, until John finally asked,
So now what?
Nate looked over at John, his mouth twisted into a wry grin. I think we'll take it with us. It may come in handy. They were still staring at the globe, enraptured, when Laura poked her helmetless head through the hatch.
Ah, there you are. The others are right behind me.
She eyed the globe in front of Nate, her eyebrows raised.
Looks like you already found something, huh? It's pretty.
Shannon snorted.
Yeah, he found it all right.
Then Ty, Kevin, Jesse, and Shauna were all crowding through the hatch into the bridge and exclaiming over the globe. Ty immediately pushed himself off the doorway toward Nate in an effort to see it more closely, which ended with Nate trying to grip the console with his legs while holding the globe in one arm and attempting to catch Ty with the other. Then came Shannon's acerbic account of how Nate had come into possession of it, with more emphasis than Nate would have liked on how he'd had no idea what he was doing. She finished with a grin in his direction that made it clear she was mostly teasing him. There were a few good-natured jibes, and Kevin moved to examine the globe himself, eventually asking, What's our objective? We don't know how much air's left in this heap. Can't be more than a few hours, right? Unless the scrubbers are still running. He looked doubtful. Rachel huffed.
Heap nothing. She's been sitting here for 1,000 years and she's still holding air. What other ship can you say that about?
Kevin shrugged uncomfortably. Sorry, no offense. I've been hearing talk about the vessel my whole life. I was practically expecting something magical. My own fault, really. Nate shook his head wryly. Let's have a look around and see what's here. Anything John and Rachel want to look at, they can. It's their ship and their show. The others agreed and spread out to try the other hatches along the corridor leading to the bridge. The first find came almost immediately. Rachel stuck her head out of a compartment at the end of the hall, calling for Nate. Of course, everyone had to gather again to see what she'd found. Inside what, according to John, used to be the captain's private office, metal loops lined one wall. Each loop had a pendant attached to it, much like those that graced John and Rachel's necks. There were 3 empty loops at one end of the row, but 10 of them were still occupied. The pendant's gems were identical in shape to John and Rachel's, but each had a different color that caught the light from the room's ceiling fixtures. Jesse stared at the row of pendants, his eyes widening.
Paul's amulets. He made 12 of them before he finally created the sigil. Dad always said they're the most powerful E6 artifacts in the galaxy.
He paused for a second, then shrugged.
At least, they're the most powerful ones Paul left behind. Dad was always a little afraid of what Paul might have made and never talked about.
Nate pulled himself to a stop at the desk by one wall and looked at the amulets thoughtfully as the others crowded into the room behind him and Rachel. Noting the 3 empty loops and the glow coming from the pendants around his, Rachel's, and John's necks, Nate called back to the rest of the group. One for each of you, I think. I'll carry the rest for now. Ty was, of course, the first to reach them, and after passing his hand over each of the gems, he picked out a light blue crystal that instantly began to glow when he put it around his neck. Ty's eyes grew large, and he looked at Nate.
This is so much power. I'm like 5 Energematrists now. 50!
Ty was right. When Nate looked at the amulet using Energematrice 6, it was a very curious object indeed. Like Nate's own sigil of mysteries, it looked almost like an inverted funnel, or maybe a concave lens, bending the fields as they streamed through it, focusing and multiplying them dramatically. Nate snorted. Lightmaker help us all. Remember what I told you about power, will you? Ty nodded, grinning, and pushed off for the door, obviously intent on seeing what else he might find. The others made picking theirs into a ritual of sorts. Shannon was next, passing her hand over each one, frowning, feeling how each interacted with Energematrice 6, and settling on a pink crystal so dark it verged on red. Each in turn did the same. Shauna took the deep green amulet. Kevin took a gray one that barely glowed, even though it seemed just as potent as the others. Laura took a long time when her turn came, eventually choosing a dark blue gem. When his turn finally came, Jesse hesitated, clearly uncertain. Nate frowned thoughtfully and looked Jesse directly in the eyes. "Jesse Galton, will you follow me, even if it means leaving Sanctuary and all you've ever known?" Jesse gulped visibly.
Yes. Yes, I will."
Nate inclined his head, accepting the promise. "Take one." Jesse's amulet was dark red, leaving 4, soft purple, yellow, brown, and turquoise unclaimed. Nate finally approached, taking those that remained and slipping them carefully into his pocket. The next find was less interesting for most of them. John called out to Rachel from the room that had been their father's as the head of the colony expedition. When she got there, they both bent over a piece of paper pinned to Paul's desk. Nate glanced into the room, but seeing what they were about, he left them to it. Meanwhile, Shannon had characteristically been checking to see if the vessel was functional, and to what degree. Nate found her back on the bridge, shaking her head as she paged through screens on an ancient monitor. Nate grinned. "Bit dated, huh?" Shannon glanced up at him and returned his grin.
Oh, sure. But I expected that. I'm just amazed at how close the basic design of this ship is to adamant. It's almost like they were built by the same person.
Her lips twisted.
Might have been, I guess. No way to know, really, but yeah, I know how it works.
As if on cue, Ty poked his head through the hatch.
Shannon thinks she knows everything.
He grinned cheekily at her.
And she's almost right.
Shannon snorted, but she laughed despite herself as Ty pulled his head back out into the passage. Nate smiled at her, and she nodded wryly as if Ty had made a point.
I really don't mean to be a know-it-all.
Her lack of defensiveness and Ty's obviously friendly attitude lit a warm glow inside of Nate. Maybe they really had been listening to him. He nodded back and raised his eyebrows. "So, where do we stand?" Shannon shook her head.
I wouldn't want to try to move Hope. She's been sitting too long. We obviously have auxiliary power. But it's using an E6 field tap that's so primitive, it makes my hair stand on end just being in the same ship with it. If we turned it on, it might work. Or it might not work. Catastrophically.
She shrugged.
Not really sure what you want to do.
Nate frowned thoughtfully. What about the defensive systems? Are they patched into the computer? Shannon shook her head again.
Nope. That's another reason I wouldn't want to move it. Who knows what would happen if the collision system is really tied to the moon? Wouldn't even care to guess.
Nate nodded. I think we'll leave it here, without messing with the defenses. Shannon agreed, and Nate went to search the next deck down with the others. And that ends Chapter 6 of the Vale of Mysteries. The Energematrice 6 podcast is made possible by North Arrow Coffee. North Arrow Coffee is the pro-life coffee company where 15% of every purchase goes to support organizations like Crisis Pregnancy Centers, whose purpose is to support women in the most difficult situation of their lives. If you're interested, head over to northarrowcoffee.co and use promo code E6 to get 10% off with your order.
The advertisements featured did not necessarily represent my endorsements or views.
I really appreciate everybody being here. Thank you, Mel, for doing it, despite your voice not being in tip-top form. And thank you, Luke, even though you only had like 2 lines. And oldest, second, third, thank you all. Thank you, listeners. And we will catch you all next week.